right, guys, I hope everyone is having a good week, and I will be back in class soon. So, today we are learning about William Faulkner, and he is a really important Southern writer. So, his dates are 1897 to 1962, and he grew up in Oxford, Mississippi. So, he's very familiar with the South, and he grew up in that period of Reconstruction. As you can see, he lived up through to see the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, but he lived in a time when there was a lot of strife, a lot of racial tension, and a lot of change in the South, and a lot of his stories reflect those ideas. So, a couple different things. He didn't have very much formal education. He went to school for a short time but wasn't able to finish, which is amazing because his vocabulary is extraordinary. If, hopefully you read the story. But he actually was so passionate about the cause of World War I that before the United States was involved, he decided to join the British Royal Flying Corps. And so he went and trained to become a pilot. However, he never actually saw any action in the war. But that experience is something he did draw on for his stories at times, not in A Rose for Emily, but others. And like I said before, he is mostly associated with the South. We consider him a regionalist or a regional author, as the majority of his stories. He was really interested in generational issues. Some of his most famous novels follow generations of Southern families and how they saw change and adapted, and just what kind of effect this time period had on them. Something he is well known for is experimentation with narrative structure, particularly in his novels. So we see some of his unusual narration in A Rose for Emily, and we'll talk about that. But with his novels in particular, he was one of the first authors to write a novel from multiple perspectives. So he would have one chapter written from the perspective of one character, and then in the next chapter, he would change voices, and he would then write in a first-person perspective from another character. And that's something that's very common today. I think if you've read the series Divergent, we get the story from Triss's perspective, and then in the second book, they add the perspective of For or Tobias. And, obviously, if you aren't familiar with those stories, that may not ring a bell with you, but hopefully that's a good contemporary example. All right, so that's William Faulkner. And you guys read A Rose for Emily, which is quite the story. It's kind of a horror / mystery. I can't even really give you the genre. Well, I can. We're going to talk about Southern Gothic literature in our next unit, and this A Rose for Emily falls into that genre. But it is an incredibly unique story with that shocking ending, which, again, I hope you read it before watching the video, because it's gonna be really hard to follow if you haven't read this story. This discussion isn't going to make a whole lot of sense. So, this story is character-driven. So we have to start out by talking about Miss Emily. She is our main character, and we'll come to later whether or not she's sympathetic. But the first thing we need to establish is the significance of her family. All right? Emily was the last Grierson. Okay, so she came from the Southern family, and they were very important. So let's read a little bit. This story starts on page 794. Hope you have your books open as I point out some key quotes here. So page 794, I'm going to read you the first paragraph. When Miss Emily Grierson died, our whole town went to her funeral. The men through a sort of respectful affection for a fallen monument, the women mostly out of curiosity to see the inside of her house, which no one, save an old manservant, a combined gardener and cook, had seen in at least 10 years. It was a big squarish frame house that had once been white, decorated with cupolas and spires and scrolled balconies in the heavily lightsome style of the 70s, set on what had once been our most select street. So she lived in like what used to be the really wealthy part of town. But garages and cotton gins had encroached and obliterated even the august names of that neighborhood, and only Miss Emily's house was left, lifting its stubborn and coquettish decay above the cotton wagons and gasoline pumps, an eyesore among eyesores. Now Miss Emily had gone to join the representatives of those august names where they lay in the Cedar Bemused Cemetery. All right. So the word august, if you don't know that word, just means respected, of high society. So we get the idea that Miss Emily was someone who, at least in the past, came from this really significant family heritage. In fact, they compare her to everyone went to her funeral, and the men saw her as a fallen monument. So what do monuments usually do? How do they function? They represent the past, right? Something that was significant. Like in Washington, D.C., we have monuments to our presidents, right? We have monuments to Abraham Lincoln. We have monuments to old war heroes. And so that's how they viewed Miss Emily. She was the last Grierson. She and her family were kind of this symbol of past wealth. So I hope you can already see here, Emily in a lot of ways is symbolic of the Old South and the Old South's traditions. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the townspeople's attitude towards her, because what's interesting is what we have here is a collective narrative, right? Like, look at that first sentence. When Miss Emily Grierson died, our whole town went to her funeral. So we have a plural first person pronoun, our. So this story is told from the perspective of the townspeople. So it's really important to understand tone, to understand their tone, their attitude towards Miss Emily and everything that she represented to them. So we already have a couple details here. You know, they're respectful, they're curious, they don't really understand her. Look down at the third paragraph of the story. Alive, Miss Emily had been a tradition, a duty, and a care, a sort of hereditary obligation upon the town. So again, associating her with the idea of tradition, and it's like they almost felt responsible to take care of her. And it talks about how there's this story of how, because their family, they had all the status, but they ran out of money. And so the Colonel Sartoris, the mayor, remitted her taxes, the dispensation dating from the death of her father on into perpetuity. Not that Miss Emily would have accepted charity. Colonel Sartoris invented an involved tale to the effect that Miss Emily's father had loaned money to the town, and now they were paying her back. But that was just a lie. So basically, to help her save face, the colonel had said, like, oh, well, you know, you don't have to pay taxes to the town. And what's interesting is, you know, the next generation of town leadership comes up, and Miss Emily, she's like, I don't have to pay taxes. Like, I don't pay taxes in this town. And so she stays stuck in the past as life progresses. All right, let me point out one more quote about this. Turn to page 796. This, again, adds more towards the people's view of Miss Emily. All right, page 796, that second big paragraph. It says, that was when people had begun to feel really sorry for her. People in our town, remembering how old Lady Wyatt, her great aunt, had gone completely crazy at the last, believed that the Griersons held themselves a little too high for what they really were. None of the young men were quite good enough for Miss Emily and such. We had long thought of them as a tableau. Miss Emily, a slender figure in white in the background, her father, a spraddled silhouette in the foreground, his back to her and clutching a horsewhip, the two of them framed by the back-flung front door. So when she got to be 30 and was still single, we were not pleased exactly, but vindicated. All right, so they feel sorry for her, they have pity for her, but at the same time, they think that the Griersons are just a little too stuck up for their own good. And as you can see, she lives to become the old age of 30 and is unmarried because while her father was alive, none of the young men were good enough. So more than anything, I want you guys to see that Miss Emily is a mysterious character to the townspeople. They don't really understand her, which leads us to the question, can we really know what Miss Emily was like? Like, did any one of these people have a close encounter with her? No, they just observe her from afar. And so to their mystery and intrigue and the ambiguity of their attitude transfers to us, the audience, the reader. We also see Miss Emily in a very ambiguous light, and she's mysterious to us, which is something that Faulkner does intentionally. He creates this kind of intriguing character that we don't really understand, which is part of what makes the ending of the story so incredibly shocking, because she's kind of painted in the beginning as this stuffy, proper spinster, and then we get to the end, and, that's not the case. Okay, so Miss Emily's single for a long time, and then enter some sort of love interest, and his name is Homer Barron. All right, so she's never really dated anyone, and this guy comes along named Homer. And so I want us to talk about the ways that Homer is like Emily, and also how he is different from her, because they have a couple similarities, but they're also vastly different. All right, look at the little chapter 3 at the bottom of page 796. All right, look at the second paragraph. The town had just let the contracts for the paving the sidewalks, and in the summer after her father's death, they began to work. The construction company came with niggers and mules and machinery and a foreman named Homer Barron, a Yankee, a big, dark, ruddy man with a big voice and eyes lighter than his face. The little boys would follow in groups to hear him cuss the niggers, and the niggers singing in time to the rise and fall of pigs. Pretty soon, he knew everybody in town. Wherever you heard a lot of laughter anywhere about the square, Homer Barron would be in the center of the group. Okay, so in some ways, he's like Emily in that he's an outsider, right? He's from the north. And he's also this larger-than-life character, right? He's set apart from the crowd, like Emily is. What's mainly different is that people like him, right? He actually interacts with the town people and has relationships with them, right? There's laughter, there's socializing, there's stuff going on. So if you look where I left off, it says, presently, we began to see him and Miss Emily on Sunday afternoons driving in the yellow-wheeled buggy and the matched team of bays from the livery stable. All right, at first we were glad that Miss Emily would have an interest because the ladies all said, of course, a Grierson would not think seriously of a northerner, a day laborer. But there were still others, older people, who said that even grief could not cause a real lady to forget noblesse oblige, which basically like her place, without calling it noblesse oblige. They just said, poor Emily. All right, so what's creating this scandal about the relationship is really their disparity in social class, right? First of all, he's a day laborer. He is someone who has to work for his money, whereas Miss Emily came from a family that had money, right? Obviously, they ran out of money, but she was of the upper class, the old Southern aristocracy, and Homer is a much more lower class man. And so there's all this scandal about the two of them, taking Sunday drives together. And, everyone has different ideas of like, oh, poor Emily, he's leading her on. And some people think, well, maybe they're really going to get married. But there's all kinds of confusion and scandal and gossip about their relationship in the town. So, all right, so now that we have kind of two of our main characters established here, we've talked about the narration, What we really need to talk about next, because this is what can really throw you for a loop, is the narrative structure. Because if you didn't catch on, all right, this story is told in a series of flashbacks. And even more importantly, they are not in chronological order, right? We have all these little snippets from Miss Emily's life, but they're not told in the order of how things happened, okay? And the reason that Faulkner does that is a couple reasons. First of all, he wants to build tension, right? He is building to that climactic, shocking ending. He wants to horrify his reader with the capabilities of Miss Emily. So he's got this tension building throughout. He also wants to create more confusion around the character of Miss Emily. And by limiting our understanding of her, the ending becomes that much more impactful. Does that make sense? It's kind of like if you watch a Sherlock Holmes movie or episode, the Benedict Cumberbatch version is, of course, the best. You get all these little snippets of the story, and that way when you get to the end and Sherlock puts all the pieces together, you get that epiphany, right? That moment where you're like, yes, that makes sense. And it's very enjoyable as an audience to have that moment of putting the pieces together and having that sudden insight and understanding to what really happened in this story. So Faulkner very cleverly does that for us. So, and again, just to clarify, like it starts with her funeral, right? At the beginning of chapter 2, it talks about a bad smell at her house. Okay? Then we talk about the death of her father. All right? We talk about Homer Barron. We talk about arsenic. Then we talk about Homer again. And so it's just, it's all choppy. So the next thing I want us to look at is foreshadowing, because the foreshadowing is really important. And I want to give you a couple of specific examples. First of all, the death of her father. All right, so turn to page 796 if you're not there already. I think this is the last place we read. All right, so right before the chapter break, all right, so about halfway down the page, it talks about when her dad dies, and it says, the day after his death, all the ladies prepared to call at the house and offer condolence and aid, as is our custom. Miss Emily met them at the door, dressed as usual and with no trace of grief on her face. She told them that her father was not dead. She did that for 3 days, with the ministers calling on her and the doctors, trying to persuade her to let them dispose of the body. And just as they were about to resort to law and force, she broke down and they buried her father quickly. We did not say she was crazy then. We believed she had to do that. We remembered all the young men her father had driven away, and we knew that with nothing left, she would have to cling to that which had robbed her, as people will. Okay, so if you read the story, you know that her denial of death is foreshadowing the end of the story. So I feel like I'm giving a spoiler, so again, I really hope you read the story. But the shocking ending, when they find the decomposing body in her house, is foreshadowed right here by the fact that when her father died, she did not acknowledge his death, all right? I guess she's like, oh, he's just sleeping. He's taking a nap for 3 days. And so what this does is it prepares us for that shocking ending when they realize that she has kept the corpse of Homer Barron in her bedroom for years and years and years. And so what Faulkner's doing is he's giving us little hints and little clues and preparing us for that final resolution. The other element of foreshadowing I wanted to point out to you was this idea of the smell, right? Look back at page 795, the beginning of chapter 2. So she vanquished them horse and foot, just as she had vanquished their fathers 30 years before, about the smell. That was about 2 years after her father's death, and a short time after her sweetheart, the one we believe would marry her, had deserted her. All right, so again, but we haven't even learned about Homer yet, but now we know there's a bad smell shortly after he deserted her. Okay? Turn back to page 796. So her house smells bad, and so the town has this meeting to try and figure it out. And they talk to Judge Stevens, what are we going to do? And it says, Judge Stevens says, will you accuse a lady to her face of smelling bad? So the next night, after midnight, 4 men crossed Miss Emily's lawn and slunk about the house like burglars, sniffing along the base of the brickwork and at the cellar openings, while one of them performed a regular sewing motion with his hand out of a sack slung from his shoulder. They broke open the cellar door and sprinkled lime there and in all the outbuildings. And then it talked about how after a week or two, the smell went away. And so we haven't learned yet about Homer Barron and how he disappeared one day. And we haven't learned yet that Miss Emily has bought arsenic, supposedly for rats. However, what is this foreshadowing? The fact that she has a decomposing body stowed away in her bedroom. But Faulkner gives us this information very early in the story before we have any cause to suspect that she's a murderer. Does that make sense? And so all these little clues and hints. And honestly, this is one of those stories that if you read it a second time, it will make so much more sense. Once you know the ending and you go back and you read it again, at almost every paragraph, you'll be like, oh, now that makes sense. Oh, I get that little detail. So I encourage you, especially if you like this story, to consider reading it a second time to have a really full understanding of what's going on there. So let's talk a little bit more about the ending. So go ahead and turn to page 798. And so, she and Homer have been hanging out, and then one day he's just gone. So page 798 in the middle of the page, it says, so we were not surprised when Homer Barron, the streets had been finished for some time, was gone. We were a little disappointed that there was not a public blowing off, but we believed that he had gone on to prepare for Miss Emily's coming or to give her a chance to get rid of the cousins. All right, so apparently her family members had come to try and talk her out of marrying Homer Barron because it's such a bad idea. And the last time they saw him, about the middle of this page, sure enough, after another week, they departed, and as we had expected all along, within 3 days, Homer Barron was back in town. A neighbor saw the Negro man admit him at the kitchen door at dusk one evening, and that was the last we saw of Homer Barron, and of Miss Emily for some time. All right, so he just disappears. And then, if you look at chapter 5, okay, and we're just going to read the ending here. All right, page 799, the last couple paragraphs. Already we knew that there was one room in that region above stairs which no one had seen in 40 years, and which would have to be forced. They waited until Miss Emily was decently in the ground before they opened it. The violence of breaking down the door seemed to fill this room with pervading dust. A thin, acrid pall, as of the tomb, seemed to lie everywhere upon this room, decked and furnished as for a bridal. Upon the valance curtains of a faded rose color, upon the rose-shaded lights, upon the dressing table, upon the delicate array of crystal, and the man's toilet things backed with tarnished silver so tarnished that the monogram was obscured. Among them lay a collar and tie as if they had just been removed, which left upon the surface, I'm on page 800 now, a pale crescent in the dust. Upon a chair hung the suit, carefully folded, beneath it the 2 mute shoes and the discarded socks, but the man himself lay in the bed. For a long while we stood there, looking down at the profound and fleshless grin. The body had apparently once lain in the attitude of an embrace, but now the long sleep that outlasts love, that conquers even the grimmest of love, had cuckolded him, which just means had cheated him. What was left of him, rotted beneath what was left of the nightshirt, had become inextricable from the bed in which he lay. And upon him, and upon the pillow beside him, lay that even coating of the patient and biting dust. And here's the really chilling detail. Then we noticed that in the second pillow was the indentation of a head. One of us lifted something from it, and leaning forward, that faint and invisible dust, dry and acrid in the nostrils, we saw a long strand of iron gray hair. So if you're not following along, the implication is that she poisoned Homer Barron, she killed him, and then pretended that his corpse was her husband, even to the point of lying in bed with this decomposing body, right? They find her hair on the pillow next to his corpse. And so this idea of necrophilia and that kind of insanity and grotesqueness is incredibly shocking. What's even more shocking is, who is Miss Emily supposed to be? She's supposed to be the most proper, high-class woman in town, right? And she is the one who has committed the most gruesome and atrocious crime. Do you see that contrast? All right, so let's talk about symbols. There's a lot of symbolism in this story. The first one I want to discuss is the house. And we've already read some of these quotes, but the house in a lot of ways is a symbol of Miss Emily, right? It's out of place. It no longer fits in the neighborhood. And if you look back at that early, that first, those first couple paragraphs where it describes how fancy it was, but it was falling into decay, and, it was no longer even in a residential neighborhood. So that's Miss Emily. She no longer fit in her community. She represented, the dying traditions of the South. Out of place, no longer make sense. Many would even say the fact that the house, no one ever goes in the house, except for her and her servant, represent, it's symbolic of the mystery of Miss Emily. A further detail, and let's see, where is this detail in the story? I can't remember where it is, but it talks about how at one point, about how she shuts up the second story of the house, like those windows get boarded up in the second story. And a lot of people, critics, will say that this is, there it is on page 799. Now and then we would see her in one of the downstairs windows. She had evidently shut up the top floor of the house. That's almost like her insanity, right? Like the lights don't go on in the top story. Her top story has shut down in that sense. So the house is a great symbol of Miss Emily herself. The traditions of the Old South, we can see that throughout this story. And I didn't get into real detail in this as we talked through the story, but the fact that she doesn't pay taxes, even when the newer generation starts to demand them, and also the fact that once they implement the new postal system and they want to put like a number on her house, she refuses that. So she refuses, and again, this goes along with the symbolism of Miss Emily herself, she refuses anything having to do with the new generation, right? She is stuck in the Old South, and the Old South is dying. And then finally, the Bridal Suite. So like that last description, those last few paragraphs I read of the story, that room where Homer Barron's body is described as a bridal suite, like all the pink-colored things and his monogrammed brushes and combs. And that's what they mean by toilet set. Sometimes I have students who be like, why does she have a silver toilet? That's really weird. No, like toiletries, like, a monogrammed hairbrush or comb or something like that, shaving kit. So basically, this represents, in so many ways, the bridal suite. And this is what's so sad. What are aristocratic ladies supposed to do? They're supposed to get married, right? Miss Emily wasn't supposed to have a job or make money or be independent. She was supposed to get married. And so in her crime, even in all its grotesqueness, was Miss Emily's final grasping of these old traditions. She said, well, dang it, if no one will marry me, I'm going to make it happen, right? Like, this is what I'm supposed to do, and I'm going to, hell or high water, I'm going to get me a husband. And so that's what she does. And so it really, at the end of the day, is very, very sad that she is driven to such lengths and obviously kind of loses her mind in her pursuit of marriage. And again, that marriage, this idea of the expectation of marrying being one of those old traditions. And then finally, overall in this story, we see themes of both tradition and death. You could even put those together, the death of tradition. So the death of Miss Emily represents the death of the traditions of the Old South. And so, as you can see, Faulkner had some things to say about the way old things were and how the newer generations don't really understand the old ways. But nor did he particularly paint the old ways in a good light. But definitely an intriguing story, especially that ending. Like I said, if you read it a second time, it'll make a whole lot more sense to you. And then finally, I did want to talk about the title. A Rose for Emily is the title of the story. And there's a couple of different interpretations of A Rose for Emily. The one that makes the most sense to me is the idea of, so you can picture all the townspeople standing around at her funeral telling these stories about Miss Emily, right? Like, remember when she rode around in the carriage? Remember when we saw her father driving her boyfriends away? You know, they're having all these memories. And so in some ways, their remembrance of her, their telling this story, is like the offering of a rose at her funeral, okay? So the story itself is their rose for Emily. They are, even though Emily, along with these old traditions, have died, they are honoring her memory by telling the story. Does that make sense? And some people talk about the rose for Emily being the idea of marriage. There's lots of rose colors in that final scene, the description of the rose shaded lights and the rose-colored curtains and all that. But we do typically associate roses with love, romantic love, and so it does kind of fit in. Poor Miss Emily was looking for love, and the only way she could find it was to poison it and keep it in her house. So there are a lot of other things I could say about A Rose for Emily, but those are the main ideas. And the main takeaway I want you to have from this story is particularly the narrative structure, like this telling of the story in a way that's non-chronological, this use of foreshadowing. How does that contribute to the meaning of the story, right? Like Faulkner's mysterious tone and the tension he builds and the way he reveals the plot points is really, really key in understanding and experiencing what this story means about the death of the traditions of the Old South. All right, thanks for listening, y'all.